which is what we were stressing, the mirror for reflection. Everybody remember last week? So tonight, what I'd like to do is go backwards and start at the beginning of this, because it's really an interesting text, and certainly we'll have it up, I hope. So the formal name of the text is Ambalatika Rahula Sutta. So it's the teaching to Rahula at this place, the Mango Stone area. It's actually, I guess, a bamboo grove, and also the squirrel's feeding ground. This is what the text calls it. So the second part of the text is what we went into last week. What is the mirror for, Rahula? And this is the first part of it. Okay? Okay. So I'll just read through slowly. You can read along, and then we'll come back and look at it a little bit. So I have heard, this is the opening, thus I've heard that on one occasion the Blessed One was staying near Rajagriha at the bamboo grove, the squirrel's feeding ground. At that time, Venerable Rahula was staying at the Mango Stone. Then the Blessed One, arising from his seclusion in the late afternoon, went to where Venerable Rahula was staying at the Mango Stone. Venerable Rahula saw him coming from afar, and upon seeing him, set out a seat and water for washing the feet. The Blessed One sat down in the seat, set out, and having sat down, washed his feet. Venerable Rahula, bowing down to the Blessed One, sat to one side. Then the Blessed One, having a little bit of water in the water dipper, said to Venerable Rahula, Rahula, do you see this little bit of leftover water remaining in the water dipper? Yes, sir. That's how little of a contemplative, this is the Shramana, there is in anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie. And having tossed the water, a little bit of the leftover water away, the Blessed One said to the Venerable Rahula, Rahula, do you see how little bit of leftover water is tossed away? Yes, sir. Rahula, whatever there is of a contemplative, anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie is tossed away just like that. And then having turned the water dipper upside down, the Blessed One said to Venerable Rahula, Rahula, do you see how this water dipper is turned upside down? Yes, sir. Rahula, whatever there is of a contemplative in anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie is turned upside down just like that. And having turned the water dipper right side up, Blessed One said to Venerable Rahula, Rahula, do you see how empty and hollow this water dipper is? Yes, sir. Rahula, whatever there is of a contemplative in anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie is empty and hollow just like that. And now the Buddha gives a extended allegory or analogy. Rahula, it's like a royal elephant, immense, pedigreed, accustomed to battles, its tusks like chariot poles. Having gone into battle, it uses its forefeet, its hind feet, its forequarters and hindquarters, its head and ears, tusks and tail, but keeps protecting its trunk. The elephant trainer noticed that and thinks, this royal elephant has not given up its life to the king. But when the royal elephant, having gone into battle, uses its forefeet, hind feet, forequarters and hindquarters, head, ears, tusk and tail, and his trunk, the trainer noticed that and thinks, this royal elephant has given up its life to the king. There is nothing it will not do. In the same way, Rahula, the Buddha has now finished the story, when anyone feels no shame in telling a deliberate lie, There is no evil I tell you, he will not do. Thus, Rahula, you should train yourself. And then, I will not tell a deliberate lie, even in jest. And then, this is where we picked up last week, remember? And what do you think, Rahula? What is the mirror for? For reflection, sir. And then the Buddha goes through the three that we had last week. So everybody recalls last week's section, right? So he says to Rahula, there's three ways you can use the reflection of the mirror. Prior to anything that you think about doing, about saying, or prior to engaging, indulging in a thought, reflect. And then on the wholesomeness, unwholesomeness, whether this is going to harm yourself, harm others, and so forth and so on. And if it's going to, you pull back. If it's not, you can go forward. And then he says, and if you're actually engaged in doing it, at that moment, use that mirror reflectively and say, is this action, this thought, this deed, this word causing this right while I'm engaged in it? What's happening? What's the effect of this? And if it's not kusala, if it's not wholesome and skillful and liberating and wise and compassionate and so forth, pull back. If it is, you can. And then the third level is, if you've already done it, then reflect. How does this feel? And so forth in the same way. So now if we go back, the reason I wanted to do this is because it really reinforces, I think, the second part. So the first part is, Rahula is this, everybody knows, is the Buddha's son who becomes a novice monk. At this point, he's, according to what we can tell, he's about 7 years old. So he's very young. He's with the community, but he still hasn't ordained because you have to be, how old? Anybody know? To formally ordain? 18, 19, yeah, 19 years old. Up to that point, you can be a novice in training, but you can't fully ordain until you're 19. So he's a novice. There's a formal exchange going on here. He prepares water for the Buddha. The Buddha washes his feet, and then he sits down to one side. And then this interesting exchange takes place. I mean, this is really wonderful because the Buddha's using the water dipper that was used to scoop up the water. So it's, anybody who's worked with kids realizes they're very fascinated with things, tools, instruments, the tangible, especially at 7 years old. So the Buddha, you can imagine the Buddha just holding the water dipper in his hand. He's got the attention of Rahula. What's he going to do with it? And then he says, do you see the little bit of water in the dipper? And of course, he sees it. And he says, this little bit that's left this is how little of a contemplative, in other words, a cultivator of the way, someone who's really working on their spiritual nature, working on their mind and body, and really trying to cultivate Shila, Samadhi, Prajna, working on this really diligently. Anyone who feels no shame at telling a deliberate lie isn't that much as this water of a contemplative. So it's very tangible. He's going to an act of lying and comparing that to, so it's not mystical, he's not saying you're Buddha nature or anything, he's just saying that's how much of a contemplative you are if you feel no shame. The key here, I think, is feeling no shame at telling a lie. And then he goes through the next stage, he tosses the water away. And he says, do you see how this is just thrown away? And Rahula says, I see that. And he says, whatever there is of a contemplative in anyone who doesn't feel shame upon telling a lie is tossed away just like that. It's just tossed to the side. Not useful. Disregarded. And then finally, he turns it upside down. I mean, this is really graphic. You see how much is there? It's useless. And now he holds up the dipper and says, what do you see? It's empty and hollow. Yes, sir, he says, it's empty and hollow. And he says, someone who tells a deliberate lie and feels no shame is empty and hollow, just like that. Now, the empty and hollow is both, you could say, symbolic of having lost virtue, having hollowed out the virtue that's accumulated, the fullness, the chi, if you want to. But empty and hollow also means depleted, nothing vital, empty, drained, vacant. And so he goes through three levels like this. What's interesting to me about this, I mean, we can all sort of jump in, because I know you did it in class as well, didn't you? Right. First of all, we don't know what the lie is. We don't even know if there's why is he saying this? You know, there's nothing in the text that says Rahula was going around telling lies in the Sangha, and the Buddha came, and oops, you know, and the Buddha does this water thing. There's nothing there. We don't know if he told a lie. Now, we can assume that there must have been a lie.
So, when we talked about this in class, the Vikshinis in the class found Chinese references that when Rahula was young, people would come to the monastery and ask, oh, is the Buddha here? Rahula would be like, oh, the Buddha's not here. Come back in the afternoon, but the Buddha would be in the temple. Or he would send them to another temple and say, oh, the Buddha is there. And then they would go, and then, of course, they didn't find the Buddha there. And so this was the stories the Vikshinis found, that it was in the commentary that Rahula often did this, and obviously it frustrated a lot of people.
Okay.
So we don't know if this was the background.
This may in fact been the occasion for this. It may be also, in terms of the Buddhist tradition, lying, especially among the Sangha, isn't so much concerned with, you know, saying, oh, is Han Shan here today? No, he's gone, you know, and he's upstairs. And, you know, I think he's down in L.A., and they go down to L.A., and you think that's really funny, ha, ha, ha. That isn't really the concern. The lying has to do with claiming to have spiritual powers and displaying your powers. This is really what the depth of lying is. So it has to do with a different kind of misleading. Even if you have them, you're not supposed to brag about them and display them. So this is considered to be lying. And, you know, you could guess, well, maybe he's the Buddha's son. So he's kind of putting it on a little bit or pretending or something. We don't know. But the thing is significant about the text is the text doesn't tell us what the nature of the lie is. So the emphasis is not on the act, the physical act of the lying and the consequences of that to whoever came or not, or the people that are disappointed. It has something to do, it's an internal teaching. He's saying someone who tells a deliberate lie and feels no shame. He's talking about the feeling that Rahula should have upon misleading or being deceptive or covering over. He's addressing the internal feeling that Rahula should have. And if he doesn't have that, if he represses it, covers it over, doesn't pay attention to it, he becomes then useless. So the actual act, it could have, I mean, you could interpret this and say, suppose Rahula was killing little animals or something. The Buddha could equally said, someone who takes the life of a living being and feels no shame or no remorse has no way of advancing in the way. It's not like the act itself, it's the internal process. And of course, this is reinforced when we get to the mirror part, because the mirror part is asking him to be aware of how he feels. This is the guiding source. The Buddha doesn't say here also, I'm ashamed of you, which would be the judgmental pronouncement. And you've disappointed me. And then Rahula would be, I've ruptured my relationship with my father, the Buddha. Right? That's not what the Buddha's saying. The Buddha doesn't even say, I'm disappointed. And the Buddha doesn't even say, I'm going to scold you. He doesn't even scold him. All he says is, if you do this and you don't feel this, you're empty and hollow. You're not much of a contemplative. This is a really interesting passage, because the emphasis here is on the teaching from within, and it's teaching the idea that you must know for yourselves if something kusala is kusala. You can't rely on others to tell you. And not only, then the implication is, if you should know for yourself, you can know for yourself. Because if you can't know for yourself, what would the use be of teaching him internally like this? So, and at 7 years old, this is really great. Because if he's got it at 7, we should have it at 70 or 17 or whatever, right? So next part, which is I find really interesting, I passed over this the first time. And that's because, again, although I grew up on a farm, we didn't have elephants. So I don't get the elephant thing here at first. And he says it's like this royal elephant. This is an elephant that's in the employ of the king. And elephant, at this time, he's talking about a war, the elephants used for war. I don't know if you've ever seen, I guess there's a new movie out. It's really involving using elephants. I guess they use them in Thailand to show one of the great battles that took place, and the elephants rode into battles. They were like the charging, and they trained all these elephants to do this. And it was really good because elephants are very sharp, they're very smart, and they're very social. So they train the elephants in this way, and I saw the filming of it, a documentary on the filming, and they got these elephants to look awesome and furious. And they go charging in, and then when they were slain in some way, the mahout, is that the word, how you say mahout? Turn them over on their side, and they're supposed to lay dead. And the elephants would lay dead like this. But they got so excited because they knew the cameras are rolling and everything, so they'd lay dead like this, and they open their eyes, and they look around to see, if other people were going, oh, the elephant, how the other elephants were doing. And they had to keep filming over and over again because all of a sudden the dead elephant was like, what's happening? So these elephants are really clever, but they were used in this way. And what he says here, and obviously Rahula would have been familiar with elephants. This is as we are with, I don't know, again, on a farm, dogs and cats and horses and pigs and cows. Dairy cows I'm very familiar with. But here it's elephants. And he says when the elephant goes in, he uses 4 feet hind feet, 4 quarters back quarters, its head, its ears, its tusk, and its tail, but doesn't use the trunk. Keeps protecting the trunk. And the elephant trainer notices this and thinks, he hasn't given up his life to the king because he's withholding the trunk. But then when the elephant goes into battle, he uses everything and he also uses his trunk. And then the elephant trainer says, now that he's given up, there's no evil. There's nothing he will not do. Now the important thing is what follows is in the same way the Buddha says to Rahula, if you have no shame and can't feel any shame at telling a deliberate lie, there is no evil you will not do. Now, where we go to interpret this is really interesting because you're kind of saying, well, I don't get it exactly. Why is it there's no evil you will not do if you don't feel shame at telling a deliberate lie? Well, well, sociopath's a little strong for a 7-year-old, but you could say that's how it begins.
It's sort of the loophole defines the law. The loophole defines
Yeah.
the law. Wherever you leave yourself out, that will eventually be sort of the dominating important aspect.
In this case, it seems to be once you cut off the sensibility, the proper sensibility that you should feel upon killing, stealing, lying, and so forth. There's natural reactions that occur in the attuned person. And so being virtuous or being moral is a natural steering in response to the reverberations, if you will, that come from certain thoughts, words, and deeds. We have it built into our system. This is called the innate virtue. This is called the awakened nature, the Buddha nature within. It's whole and complete. Many texts talk about this. In Mencius' famous passage in Cow Mountain, he describes how we have these feelings, ren. He uses a character ren, which means humaneness, kindness, decency. However, if we don't pay attention to them, if we let them get checked and cut off and truncated through internal lack of discipline with our thoughts and feelings and emotions, or bad influences on the outside, over time, they wither away. And he says, just like this mountain now that's been denuded and stripped of its trees because it's been harmed and hacked away so many times, it can't revitalize itself anymore. Same way, he says, in a person, although it may not be evident, we once too had these innate feelings of goodness, decency, and so forth. But through our processes, our choices, our decisions, and our covering over of this sensibility, masking it, over time, we no longer seem to have that available to us, and we seem like this denuded mountain that's been stripped of everything. But, he says, it isn't ever gone. It just gets buried, and occluded, so it's harder to get access to. So in this way, it seems to me what he's saying to Rahula is, really pay attention to this movement, this stirring at this moment when you tell a lie, because that's your compass to steer by. So then I started to look up why the trunk. Yes?
My question, I don't quite understand how that analogy with the elephant relates to the next idea of how it's not telling a deliberate lie. How telling a deliberate lie lets you do anything. It seems to be the flip opposite. It seems like in my previous example, you want the trainer would want the elephant to give up his life. That's a good elephant.
Well, it's a good elephant in war. You see, so you have to look at the comparison. Initially, in the class, one of the students read it that way, but then when they looked and said, in the same way, Rahula, if you don't feel ashamed telling a deliberate lie, in other words, if you give up your trunk, there's no evil you won't do. And so what he's saying is, the elephant is a killing machine, and what restrains the elephant somewhat is that it guards its trunk. It's holding back at that point, even though it's been trained. But as soon as it loses its trunk, then there's nothing it won't do. Okay? So that's what's important here. Now, if you could, I did a little research, and this was fun. Because can you bring up the elephant? I mean, not the elephant. I don't bring an elephant in. We haven't. There he is. Okay, so this is the elephant. Now let's look at this a little bit because it's very interesting. Can we read the trunk? Or the proboscis? Proboscis, thank you. Is a fusion of the nose and upper lip. Although in early fetal life, the upper lip and trunk are separated. The trunk is elongated and specialized to become the elephant's most important and versatile appendage. It contains up to 150,000 separate muscles. Packages with no bone and little fat. These paired muscles consist of two major types, superficial surface ones and internal. And the former are divided into dorsal ventrals and laterals, while the latter are divided into transverse and radius. This is an immensely complicated muscle apparatus. The muscles of the trunk connect to a bony opening in the skull. The nasal septum is composed of tiny muscle units that stretch horizontally between the nostrils. Cartilage divides the nostrils at the base. As the muscular hydrostat, the trunk moves by precisely coordinated muscle contractions. The muscles both work with and against each other. A unique proboscis nerve formed at the maxillary and facial nerves runs along the sides of the trunk. Okay, so first of all, this is an incredible thing, this trunk. Those of you who've ever studied this realize the most difficult thing for the elephant to master when it's coming into maturity is its trunk. It pretty much figures out its feet in an early stage and can move around. It's got its tail, it's got its ears going, but the trunk is like this incredibly difficult instrument for it to use. And it takes years for a baby elephant to get mastery over its trunk because it's just, there's so many muscles in the motor manipulations required to do what it has to do with it. And so it's really the last part of the elephant to develop. Now, elephant trunks have multiple functions, including breathing, olfaction. What's olfaction? Smelling. Touching, grasping, and sound production. The elephant's sense of smell may be 4 times as sensitive as that of a bloodhound. The trunk's ability to make powerful twisting and coiling movements allows it to collect food, wrestle with conspecifics, and lift up 770 pounds. It can be used for delicate tasks such as wiping an eye or checking an orifice, and is capable of cracking a peanut shell without breaking the peanut seed inside. I can't even do that all the time. With its trunk, an elephant can reach items at heights of 23 feet and dig for water under mud or sand. Not only that, but can find water through the olfactory sensibility miles and miles away. Individuals may show lateral profession when grasping their tusks. Some prefer to twist them to the left, others to the right. They can suck up water, both to drink and to spray on their bodies. An adult Asian elephant is capable of holding 2.2 gallons of water in its trunk. They also spray dust on themselves and so forth, and that's how they cool and stay refreshed. When underwater, it's used as a snorkel. And when they're playful, they use it as a soccer. When they play soccer, elephants play soccer, they move the ball and control the ball with their trunk and their feet. The African elephant has two finger-like extensions on the tip of the trunk that allow it to grasp and bring food to its mouth. Asian elephant only has one, and relies on more wrapping the food around the item, squeezing into his mouth. Asian elephants have more muscle coordination and can perform more complex tasks. Here we go. Losing the trunk would be detrimental to the elephant's survival, although in rare cases some have survived with shortened ones, and so forth. So, if we think about the analogy here, if we go back to the text, why I think what the Buddha is saying here is this is the most vital faculty that the elephant has at its disposal. It's the most sensitive, it's the most aware, it's the most attuned, it is the most discerning. And keeping that is the essence of keeping your compass for cultivating the way. When you give that up, in other words, here he's talking about the sense of shame you should feel about telling a deliberate. When you lose that, then you have cut off the sensibility. Once that sensibility is cut off, you have nothing else really to steer by, and everything is very coarse. And so you're going to lose your way very quickly. So he's tuning in, I think, to Rahula's intrinsic or innate sensibility of knowing I just did something wrong, which often in children is preceded by a blush. When we get older, we learn to cover the blush when we're telling a lie. But children, immediately, those of you who work with children know that they're very transparent on their first offenses. As they grow up and get mature and get, how we say, finished in schools, they become less and less easy to read. And so when they reach the level of high political office, you barely can tell anymore if they're telling a lie or the truth. Although Henry was telling me this story, Henry Roseman telling me a story of there was a presidential State of the Union address going on the television, and he happened to be visiting someone. It was an area in the hospital that was for those who are deaf, and so they can't hear. And he said he was watching it with them, and at just various times they would just break out laughing together and go ha, 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 and roar back. And he wasn't figuring out what was funny. And so he asked, and in sign language he found out, he said, oh, they're laughing every time the politician lies. Well, and Henry had to think, well, how do you know they're lying? And he said that they can see it in the body language. They can see it in the eyes and so forth, that we don't because we're just listening to the words, but they're actually reading something else that shows that. So I think possibly this is why this has become so important, that what he's tuning Rahula into then is that compass by which we know for ourselves. And the idea is it's whole and complete. It's in this nature that we have, and cultivating it, refining it, getting more and more sensitive to the effects of what we say, what we think, what we do, actually allows us to feel the right feelings, and therefore by these right feelings we know how to move ourselves closer and closer to awakening and so forth, and vice versa. So if you think about this, then maybe one of the purposes of the meditation practice is to just stop and quiet the normally frenetic activity and let the trunk attune, let the trunk pick up again its full capacity. So I brought this up just as a, some illustration. You're going to say something. I saw you.
Yeah, their trunk, because once they hurt their trunk, they will die. So that was,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is pretty interesting. So now, if we look at it that way, we can see how the next section about using the mirror, which he continues. So he goes from the trunk, he goes to the mirror, and again we have the reflective device now. And the mirror is something he uses to reflect his own face in. So it's self-reflection. So it's a self-reflecting thing he's asking Rahula to do at 7 years old. And so one of the terms that's used for the contemplative tradition is self-reflection. It's reflecting on the feedback that you're getting constantly that then allows you to correctly steer. Question? Jump in. Anything on this?
What would you think about the word conscience for no shame? I was asking, how about the word conscience for no shame? Because I know a lot of people react to the word shame in the Western context because they relate to guilt or a sense of feeling bad about oneself.
I think I'd have to think about it more because, conscience is one of those words that is close, I think, to this. If you consider it an innate responsiveness to something, there's a feedback mechanism that we might call conscience. This is Jiminy Cricket out of Disneyland. When I was a little kid, we used to watch Jiminy Cricket. Let your conscience be your guide, And it's a similar sort of thing. And I guess if you're talking about before the conscience gets corrupted, either by, again, internal desensitization or external brutality on it, it can be a fairly good, like the trunk, it can be fairly accurate, good to steer by. But here the Buddha's using shame, I think, not in a judgmental way, but a descriptive way. He's describing a human emotion or feeling that arises naturally when one harms or transgresses or moves away from one's integrity and virtue. There's a feeling, a break, a departure. And that causes a sense of loss and shame. Now, he doesn't mean it, I don't think, in the sense here of, I am scolding you, or this is a judgmental. He's describing it more as descriptive. This is useful. This feeling you have is useful if you can use it to self-correct. Now, if it turns into, to answer your question, or I don't know if it's a question idea, if it starts to turn into guilt and wallowing, then it doesn't become useful. It becomes another kind of attachment. And so I think what the Buddha's just saying here is that first response you feel at this, you need to pay attention to because that's your innate quickness coming, that's your trunk picking up on something sensitively and then shifting back. So that's why the next passage becomes really interesting. In the next passage he says, can we bring that back up again, last week's? Well, the rest of the sutta. The mirror section. Do you have that?
I think this is the one you sent me today.
No. Last week's.
Oh, I wasn't here last.
You can Google that, the suttas name, and then you have access to insight. So, copy that, yeah.
I guess the people I sent it to this week are not here. That's how it always... Can you find it? Yes. Okay, I don't have it. So somebody just read the first section. Because, in other words, when he goes to the mirror, he's then saying, this first response you have of shame is something you need to pay attention to. And then he says, before you do something, as you're doing something, after you do something, reflect in this way. While you're doing it, is it leading to self-affliction and to the afflictions of others? Feedback. Feedback, it's feeling. Oh boy, my yoga. What's the rest say? Painful consequences, painful results. And so you're judging this in a very pragmatic, not a judgmental, scolding way. You're actually observing, what is the effect of this on me and others? Is this liberating? Is this joyful? Is this causing kindness, compassion, insight to flourish? Or is this causing klesha and painful consequences? And so it's a very pragmatic, non-judgmental process that's being described here. This is what I think is at the heart of what we call mindfulness. If you want to use that word, it's overused these days everywhere. I mean, wow. It's probably the biggest section now in the yellow pages. People don't use yellow pages, but there's just mindfulness is everywhere. It's like rain coming. But this is at the heart of what it means. It means you have the apparatus, you have the faculties to steer by if you only pay attention. So this is why it says, don't look outside. Look within. Look within doesn't mean zone out. It means to pay attention to the feedback mechanisms that you have going. If you're sensitive, you can feel the hormones, you can feel the blood, you can feel the neurotransmitters doing their thing, and they're all speaking the wonderful Dharma. Good. Well, nope, this doesn't work. It's like hearing glass break or your nails on a chalkboard. That's what it feels like when you step out of the virtuous center. Okay? So what he's saying is you have a gyroscope to steer by. The only thing to be feared is that you won't pay attention, you won't guard the trunk and let it give you that feedback. So that, I don't know if that's an answer, but it's a little bit of a discussion around that because I don't think it's guilt. Guilt is attachment. Shame is a catalyst for change. Guilt is hanging on to shame. And instead of changing, it starts to cripple you. Because then guilt keeps you from reading things accurately again. Because your perceptions are burdened by a clinging to an negative emotional state. So that's why you correct and you move on. You sweep clean, you alert again. And this is one of the ideas of wisdom is when things appear, you reflect them, and when they're gone, the mirror is empty again. But you don't keep cluttering the mirror with downloaded images so that you can't even see the mirror's reflection anymore because it's all the things that you've done and regret and guilty and blah, blah, blah are covering over the mirror so you don't read the situation accurately anymore. Maybe one example of this, same effect. This comes... Before I did this, I used to do a lot of history. That was something that really appealed to me until I realized there wasn't a past and there's no time. And I think, well, there goes that PhD. But one of the things I was studying, I was interested in the psychology of warfare. And one occasion I got to read an essay on the training of Japanese soldiers during World War II. And part of their training was to get them to follow orders almost unflinchingly. Very much similar to the elephant described here. But the last thing to go was, if you want to say this, conscience, the trunk. And it's particularly about killing. Now, they got to a point in their training that they would kill without asking questions the enemy. In other words, uniformed soldiers with guns or so forth. But killing non-enemy combatants, or even non-enemy who weren't combatants, when they were commanded to do so as part of a war strategy to create terror or whatnot, this they reviled from, naturally did not want to do. And so in this anthropology essay I was reading, their training consisted, often they would go to some place that they've just annexed or captured, whether it was in Southeast Asia or in China, and they'd go to a village, and prior to, in the early morning when there was still mist and fog, they would be lined up doing their routines, and they would say, bayonets, put your bayonets on, bayonets forward, you're going into, and they just assumed they were going into either straw dummies, practice, or even maybe real combat, they weren't told. But what the commanding officers had done beforehand was to take women and children and old people from the village and tie them to stakes in this field and put the stakes in the ground so they were tied like this and couldn't move. And so when the young soldiers came forward, they all of a sudden realized they were being told to bayonet these helpless civilians. And at that point, they recoiled and, you know, and froze. They were in a natural state of, and when they looked around, submachine guns had been set up behind them. And their commanders were saying, either you go forward and do this, or we'll gun you down here. And from the essay, very few resisted. They did what they were. And then the article said afterwards, the commandant said, after this, there's nothing they won't do. Meaning they had broken through that last bit of resistance that was the conscience. Now, what's interesting about this is it does reveal, similar to the war elephant here, but it also reveals something that's emerging from this. This shock to the system, to the conscience, if you want to use that term, is trauma. And after this trauma, there's a post-traumatic stress. There's a post-traumatic disturbance that comes. So many soldiers who come back from combat, especially this kind of particular combat, for years, and probably sometimes for the rest of their lives, suffer from post-traumatic stress due to this kind of brutalization of their sensitivity system, especially in regards to what's considered to be proper, civilized, and good. There's a new category now that psychiatrists and mental health workers are using with increasingly modern warfare, which involves killing of civilians, unarmed populations in sometimes most brutal ways. And it's now called perpetration-induced stress disorder. So it's not like you've been traumatized because something happened to you, and like a bomb goes off and you're in, but it's a perpetration-induced. In other words, from what you've done, not what was done to you. It's perpetration-induced stress disorder. So from this and the analogy elephant, I think you can see what the Buddha's getting at in terms of our psychological makeup. It is elastic. You can go from childhood shame, and blushing, and cultivating that sensibility till you get anuttara samyak sambodhi, that you're so sensitive that the karma, the intentional actions you're doing, become so rarefied and wholesome that there's no negativity whatsoever restraining your Buddha nature from manifesting. Or you can go to perpetration and stressed disorder. You can go to serial killer and so forth. And so I think this is interesting. It's talking about a kind of elasticity and what needs to be paid attention to and what needs to be watched lest it get eroded. And in fact, if you look at, there's a list of gravity, of seriousness of offense in Buddhism regarding, I think there's 4 or 5 stages. I'm trying to remember exactly how it goes, but there's a list that breaks down the least serious to the most serious. And the least serious is you didn't intend to do it. Okay? You didn't intend, you step on a bug, or you hit an animal where you're driving, you didn't intend to do that. That one is considered to be almost not having enough intentionality, satana, to generate negative karma results. The next one is something like you didn't intend to do that, but you still intended to do something, like you were throwing stones to disperse the birds, and then you didn't mean to kill it, but one of the birds got killed by you throwing the stone. So that's a little more serious. There was an intention, but it wasn't. And it goes down. The most serious offense is, and I when I saw this, I thought, well, what is this? The most serious is, it's bad, it's wrong. You intend with full, intention to do it, and you do not know it's wrong. So the one before that is it's wrong, you intend to do it, and you do it. That's number 4. And I thought, yeah, that's the worst. But the next one is, it's wrong, you intend to do it, you actually do it, and you don't know it's wrong. And I thought, well, that should be back at 3 or 2. But what it's talking about is you're no longer able to feel the wrongness of it. You have become impervious to your moral meter, your moral barometer. You've allowed that to become so covered over that you no longer have those feelings available to you. And that's the most serious. And that's like someone you could say who is sociopathic. In other words, they do it, and you've seen interviews or something with serial killers, you realize that capacity doesn't seem to be operative. But what the Buddha is saying, you're responsible for losing it. It's not like it's lost and you say, well, I don't feel anything anymore. You are actually responsible for losing that. And so that's why the retribution of that is the most severe. It's the one that's the hardest to overcome, because if you can keep even a little bit of that, there's still a chance for transformation. There's still a chance that at that last moment, and often that occurs at the moment of death, you sort of reflect and I am sorry. And that change of consciousness is a foothold you have to alter your trajectory in future lives. But if you lose the capacity to do that, there's no transformative chi available. So it's just interesting, yeah.
It's kind of a corollary to what the story you told about Japanese soldiers, but there's this guy, a long time ago, his name is Stat Turco.
Yeah.
He wrote a series of interviews, and some of it is to interview the soldiers from Hawaii. They were fighting Japanese.
Studs Terkel. Everybody knows Studs Terkel? He's a Chicago man.
Yeah. And then one of the story he told was about these young men going to fighting Japanese after Pearl Harbor, and they said they were in darkness, and they always dropped leaflets to tell the villagers, don't come at night, because we don't know whether or not you're a soldier or a civilian. Somebody was coming, and he's like, don't come. And finally, he shot the person, and then it was a mother with a baby, and the bullet just went straight through the other side. And also, they would go to this Okinawa with a lot of caves, and then the Japanese soldiers will be in the caves with also civilians, and then the Americans would drop these gas bombs, and then ignite it at the bottom of the cave, and they would just burn the whole cave with soldiers and civilians inside. And he said basically these soldiers, before they go into combat, they drink every day. They drink whiskey, because the only way they can go to combat is to be drunk. And many of them don't drink after they come back from war, because they don't have to kill anymore. But the only way they can kill is to be drunk. And so that's an interesting corollary to that story you tell about Japanese.
Yeah, this is it's an interesting text, but I apologize. I shouldn't have done the back section first and then gone to the forefront. But this is sort of kind of not the way we're trained. We're trained to do the whole thing. And I just took that section, but I realized the actual framing of it in this forefront with the elephant and that really is helpful for understanding what he's teaching Rahula. And it reminded me, I told you the story last week about the monk who took the cherry pies and went up and then had the counter. And of course, what does it feel? How does it feel like? And I can remember a number of occasions I would ask my teacher, well, I don't know what to do here. I'm not sure what choice to make. And his question, his answer always back, and I always thought he would say, well, do this or do that. I mean, he never would say do this or do that. He said, how is it you forgot to choose? How is it you forgot to know which one you should do? How is it that you don't know? He would ask you, how is it that you don't feel? How is it you don't know? Pay attention to that. And it was a really good answer in the sense that, well, what was I neglecting intuitively that would tell me? And so he was put in the same way with like Rahula, what is you should feel, follow this feeling, pay attention to this feeling, then you know what to do. But if you've lost this feeling, if I tell you this or I tell you that, how do you know it's right or wrong? You have no compass. So the finding of the compass is the key here. This, all cultivation is about is tuning into that innate capacity. Let's see, what was a classic of purity stillness? The mind naturally tends towards purity, but our thoughts disturb it. The spirit naturally tends towards stillness, but our our desires entice it away. Those are the first two lines of the classic, and it's talking about the disturbing of those thoughts and the enticement away. That's where you pay attention. That's where you tune in, because by nature, you're tending towards purity and stillness. This is the premise here. So if you lose that, it's because you lost the feedback to recognize when you're being enticed away and when it's being disturbed. It's a real interesting, it's a kind of reverse thing. Anyhow, that's enough for tonight. Any announcements? Something? There's what?
There's a beginner Chan session at CDDB. So if people are interested in that, they can go. We're not doing anything this time. I think they just finished another retreat with a group of service students.
Okay, so all that, we'll be back to Han Shan next week, I promise. But actually, we're not departing too much, because Han Shan is actually talking about the necessity for discernment in doing this. And this text really goes into something quite specific on how to activate it, exercise it. Okay.